Okay, welcome to Criminology Unit 1. We're going to go through all these assessment components one by one, starting with AC1.1, which is entitled Compare Crime and Deviance. So what the student needs to be able to do here for the exam is have a clear definition of what crime is, how it differs from deviance, and the various sanctions that are imposed by society relating to these two things. So without further ado, let's make a start. So, as I said, you need to understand the meaning of the two terms, crime and deviance, and you've also got to understand the similarities and differences between the two concepts. So, from a starting point, crime and deviance challenge or threaten accepted values and norms of behaviour. Now let's have a look at what we mean by that. And the first thing I would say to you is that in the exam you get more marks for using technical language. So using terminology such as norms, deviance will get you more marks. So it's really important that you understand these key concepts. So let's start with a definition of what we mean by a value. Values are general principles or guidelines of how we should live our lives. We live by our values. It's what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. So it could be respecting human life, or it could be linked to what we call in schools British values, which is democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, respect and tolerance. I find it somewhat ironic that we call them British values. I think it's values that all countries would hold. When we talk about a norm, we are talking about specific rules or socially acceptable standards that govern behaviour in particular situations. Now, the important thing about norms is that they can differ from culture to culture. So have a think about what sort of norms, ways of behaving in particular situations we have in our country, the UK, or in school. So it could be anything like queuing for a bus, joining the end of the queue, not queue barging. That is the norm of behaviour in this country. It could be holding a door open for someone who's disabled, immobile, old, whatever. It could be giving up your seat on a bus to someone who's pregnant or elderly. It could be, as in our school, standing when an adult enters the classroom. Not all schools have that rule. Or it could be, as my parents drummed into me every Christmas and every birthday, that when someone gives you a present, you're expected to write them a thank you note. So these are the sort of things I mean by a norm. It's the general accepted way that one should behave. So there's our definition, acceptable standards that govern people's behaviour in particular situations. That's a norm. So norms, by their very nature, in a society are going to be linked to the values of that society, and they are going to keep in check deviant behaviour. Now, I haven't defined deviant behaviour yet, but just remember that when we come through to the definition. And norms can be explicit, such as laws, so laws set down how we must behave, or implicit, such as unwritten rules, such as giving up your seat on a bus, or saying thank you, or putting your knife and fork together on a plate to indicate that you've finished a meal. And norms generally, or some norms, are learned by growing up in a particular culture. The norms of the culture become embedded within you as you grow up. They become what sociologists, what criminologists would say, they become internalised, they become part of who you are. And this brings us down to the first definition of deviance, which is when you violate a social norm, that is deviance. It's anything that differs from the norm of society. So therefore, logically it follows that by definition, all crime is deviant. It has to be deviant because it's going against the accepted laws of the country, so it's deviating from the norms, because part of those norms, those explicit norms, the laws, are the accepted way of behaving. So all crime is deviant. However, not all deviance is crime. So hijacking a car, twocking, taken without owner's consent, would be seen as crime and it's deviant, whereas having multiple tattoos, inserts to make you look like the devil, might be a bit strange, which I would consider it to be. Therefore, it goes against my norms, therefore I would class it as deviant. However, it's not against the law and therefore it's not a crime. So I've given you, there's a link, another link to deviance. So let's go into that in a little more detail. So it's differing from the norms of society. It's behaviour which offends against norms, moral codes and values. So when I use the phrase moral code, I mean a basic set of rules, values and principles that are held by an individual, a group, an organisation or society as a whole. So that could be your own personal moral codes. So if you hold, for instance, a religious belief, you may have certain moral codes linked to that. If you belong to a specific group, let's say you're in the Boy Scouts, the Girl Guides, the Brownies or whatever, there'll be certain codes that are linked to that. An organisation such as a school, your place of work, will also have certain rules or codes that you have to adhere to. And of course society has its laws, its moral codes as a whole. So a moral code may be written down, such as the Police Code of Ethics, and that's a written guide to the core principles and standards that the police are expected to uphold in their work. And if you want to see that in more detail, you can click on the link that I have supplied here. Obviously, if you're watching this on YouTube, you're not going to be able to, you'll just have to copy the link, but that gives you a link through to the Police Code of Ethics. And there are a number of different things that they are expected to adhere to, so worth a look at that. So there's an example of a moral code. And breaking a moral code in general would be considered serious within the society that the code relates to. So deviance is any behaviour that differs from the norm, the normal. It's behaviour that's unusual, it's uncommon, or it's out of the ordinary in some way. And of course, behaviour that's out of the ordinary in some way can be defined in various different ways. So deviance could refer to behaviour that's unusual and good, such as heroically risking one's life to save someone else. This bloke here being decorated by Barack Obama, the one-time president of the United States. He was a Marine who, you can see from his injuries, threw himself onto a grenade to protect his fellow soldiers, risked his life, suffered horrendous injuries, but saved many members of his platoon. So he was honoured with the Congressional Medal of Honor. So that might be defined as deviant behaviour, but it's good deviant behaviour. Then you can have behaviour that's deviant, that's unusual and eccentric or bizarre, such as people that talk to the trees in the park, or huge hoard huge quantities of old newspapers. So here there's nothing illegal with living like this, but it's certainly a little eccentric or bizarre. And of course there's behaviour that's unusual and bad and disapproved of, such as physically attacking someone for no reason. And that's where we move into the criminal definition of deviance. And of course that's what this course is much more interested with, that criminal element of deviance. So it's important for the exam to know what sanctions can be imposed by society for deviant behaviour. And these sanctions will depend on the behaviour that's being exhibited. So the first sanctions you need to be aware of, again, make sure you use technical vocabulary. Formal sanctions. And formal sanctions are ones that are imposed by official bodies, so the police, courts, school rules, other institutions. They're punishments for breaking those formal written rules or laws. For example, courts could fine an offender for theft. Schools may exclude students for bullying. All of those are formal sanctions. Informal sanctions are used when rules are not formally written down. They're perhaps those unspoken rules, those ways of behaviour, those norms that are not laws. When someone breaks these rules, Others show their disapproval in informal ways, such as refusing to speak to them, telling them off, giving them dirty looks. Someone cue barges. Tutting is a very British thing to do. So, giving someone evils, as Vicky Pollard says there. So all of these are sort of informal sanctions. When my children were naughty, I made them sit, and maybe some of you may, on the naughty step. The naughty step would be an informal sanction. And of course, you can start to think of other informal sanctions. I've given you a few here, but you can think of your own informal sanctions and apply those as and when you wish. Now, obviously, you can also have positive sanctions. So informal and formal sanctions can be positive. So rewards for behaviour that society approves of, e.g. medals for sporting achievement, or praise from a parent or teacher. They're both formal, it can be both formal and informal. So here we see the Olympic medal bronze winning men's 8 rowing team in Tokyo. I put this one up only because one of the rowers over here, Jacob Dawson, I used to teach. So there we go. And of course, some of you may have got a little trophy from school saying well done. You can see here, free custom insert your engraving here. That would be an example of an informal positive sanction. And of course, the other way that this is linked is this idea of social control. Now, you will do an awful lot on social control when we move into Unit 4. All my PowerPoints for Unit 4 are on the YouTube channel. And again, social control could be both formal or informal. It can be positive or negative. But all sanctions, any sanction, both positive or negative, is a form of social control. And what we mean by social control is, it's the way that society tries to control our behaviour, making sure that we conform to its norms and the behaviours that others expect us to follow. So examples of how that's done would be CCTV. If you know you're being watched, you behave. Or the fact that when I'm driving down the road and I see a speed camera, a Gatso camera, I slow down. Not that I'd ever speed, but I maintain the speed limit. And that camera is controlling the way I behave, and it's making me conform to the laws of the country. So those are examples of social control. Again, I said we'll do much more on social control when we move into Unit 4. But of course, it's important you understand that these sanctions we use against deviance are a form of social control. It's making us adhere to the norms of behaviour, hoping that in general we internalise and it becomes second nature to us to conform. So that's deviance covered in a nutshell. Let's move on to what we mean by crime and criminal behaviour. And as I said before, obviously criminal behaviour is by its very definition deviant as well. So it's a form of deviance that involves serious harmful acts that are wrong against society. So these acts are regarded as so disruptive that the state must intervene on behalf of society to forbid them and then punish such acts by law. So let's look at a legal definition. So in law, criminal behaviour is any action that's forbidden by criminal law. For a court to consider a defendant's action to be a crime, normally it's got to have 2 elements. So we're going to do a bit of Latin here now, guys. And if you can refer to these terms in any answer you're using, it's going to get you more marks. And they need to become second nature to you. So for something to be considered a crime, in general, it's got to have the element of actus reus. Okay, actus is basically the Latin for act, and reus means guilty. So it's the act itself has got to be wrong. It's got to be guilty. And then at the same time, it's got to be mens rea. So it's got to be a guilty mind. Okay, so not only must the act itself be wrong, but the motive itself must be wrong. The thought in the criminal must be wrong. It's got to be intentional. So in other words, the defendant must have done something wrong that the law forbids, and they've got to have done it with bad intentions. That generally are the two elements of criminal behaviour. Actus reus, guilty act, mens rea, guilty mind. So, actus reus plus mens rea equals crime. Thinking you're going to hurt someone and then actually going out and smacking them in the face. Therefore, assault, a crime. In some cases, however, and these are cases of strict liability, mens rea, the thought behind it, isn't required. And that is when the act in its own is enough to convict someone. And these tend to be in cases of negligence, when health and safety laws are broken, when someone hasn't been responsible in ensuring that a building's done safely, etc. They may not have meant to hurt anyone by not following health and safety standards, but of course they have, and therefore health and safety law has been broken. The actus reus is enough to convict. And the other time when it's not applied is in self-defense. So when you assault someone, an actus reus, with a deliberate intention to harm them, mens rea, as I've shown here in this cartoon, it's a criminal act. However, it's done in self-defense, it's not a crime as long as the force used was reasonable in the situation. So there you've got a couple of exceptions to the rule that you can apply. So we've looked at a legal definition of crime, but also you could argue that there's a social definition of crime as well. So some people would say that crime is a label from social interaction or a wrong against the community. Because if a society has said that an act is a crime, then it becomes one. So crimes have consequences that are detrimental in some way to the community at large or one or more people within it. Now, in our society, some crimes are universally disapproved of. For example, sex offences, especially those involving children. You'd be hard pressed to find anyone who said that is acceptable. However, some acts are crimes in some countries, but not in others. And this links to why we think it might be a social definition for crime. For instance, most people in the UK would think it's wrong to have sex with a 14-year-old. However, forced marriages exist in some countries such as Bangladesh, where children become child brides. So therefore, it's difficult to find a social definition for the word criminal because opinions can vary from society to society. The norms of society differ. And there you can see, a quarter of the world's women are child bride. You can see, there's some statistics to give credence to the argument that I'm putting. Okay. So, of course, because it's societal, because it differs from society to society, there are going to be different views of criminal behaviour. The public often have a different view of what acts are really crimes compared to the legal definition of crime. So, it may be against the law, but many people don't think it's a crime or don't see it as being a crime. For example, many people may not see themselves as criminal. Fare dodgers, motorists who go a little over the speed limit, users of soft drugs, workers who take home stationery from the office. Now, technically, going a little over the speed limit is breaking the law. Stealing stationery from work is theft. Illegally downloading movies is against the law. Smoking cannabis technically is against the law. Fare dodging is against the law. And how many of you will have gone onto iPlayer and you don't have a TV license and clicked I have a TV license? Technically, you are breaking the law. But again, most people do not see these things as crimes. Maybe deviant behaviour, but not necessarily criminal. However, technically it is. So let's look specifically at acts that are criminal. So criminal acts are ones that break the law. There are lots of different kinds of criminal acts, and we can classify them either in terms of their seriousness or their subject matter. So let's take seriousness of the offence first. Now, in UK law, there are two main types of offence. Again, we'll touch on this again in Unit 4, but it's really important you understand these definitions from the word go. And again, technical vocabulary, so use these phrases. So we have summary offences. Now, in general, summary offences are less serious, and summary offences are tried in a magistrate's court. I think round about 96% of all court cases are heard in a magistrate's court. So these are minor offences such as speeding, shoplifting, possession of cannabis, that sort of stuff. And then we have what are called indictable offences. These are more serious and they are tried in a Crown Court, such as, and crimes would be rape, murder, etc. Now, the difference between a magistrate's court and a Crown Court, again, we'll do this in considerable more detail in Unit 4, is basically the Crown Court has a judge and a jury, whereas a magistrate's court does not have a jury. It's 3 magistrates that make the decision. It's a tribunal, 3 people. So there you see your magistrate's court, there's the tribunal, 3 people who make the decision on guilt. Still a defence and a prosecution lawyer, but it's 3 people that make the decision, not a jury. And there's your Crown Court with a judge and a jury. And again, defendant, prosecutor, etc. We will do this in considerably more detail in Unit 4. But remember those 2 phrases, summary offence, indictable offence. So if we go by subject matter, generally you can split up crime into violence against the person, so that would cover crimes such as murder, manslaughter, assault, GBH, that sort of thing. Then you've got sexual offences, rape, sex trafficking, grooming, etc. Offences against property, which will be burglary, theft, robbery. Fraud and forgery, such as frauds carried out by company directors, etc. Criminal damage, arson, graffiti, whatever. And drug offences such as supplying or possessing heroin. So you can either go by seriousness or subject matter, up to you how you choose to do it. And finally, your last but by no means least, public order offences, which will be riot, violent disorder, that sort of thing. So what sanctions do we have against criminals? This you have to know, guys. It comes up year in, year out as an exam question. So I'm going to go through this bit by bit. Hopefully it will all make sense. So every crime has a penalty that's laid down by law that can be imposed by a judge or a magistrate on those convicted of a crime. And of course the sanctions vary according to the severity of the crime. And as I said before, these sanctions can be imposed by the courts or the police, magistrates, etc. And it's dependent on the offence. So if we go with court sanctions, and I mean both a Crown Court and a Magistrates' Court, they can give basically 4 different types of sanction. First sanction they can give is a custodial sentence. In general, custodial sentences are given for serious offences. So custodial sentence is imprisonment, or if you're a youth, a detention to young offenders institution. That should have an apostrophe on offenders, so I'll crack that later. Now the length of the sentence could be a matter of days, or it could be up to life imprisonment for murder. Now if someone's found guilty of murder in this country, the person has to be given a life sentence. It's mandatory. So all found guilty of murder, it's a mandatory life sentence. And if you serve life, you are eligible for parole after 15 years, but actually the court can impose a longer minimum sentence in more serious cases. So for instance, the guy that was found guilty of helping the guy carry out the Ariana Grande terror attack, I think he has been given a life sentence but must serve a minimum of 33 years before he's eligible for parole. So it can be different. Now it's also important that you know that there are some people who have indeterminate sentences, which means they are not eligible for parole. These tend to be people who've killed multiple people, or the police, or they've killed police officers. There's some, they can only, say that again, Sprankle. They can own, the parole board has the final decision as to whether they can be let out or not. They don't. And some have been in forever and will not get out. But in 2012, we stopped doing that. So there are people that are still in prison that were convicted before 2012, but since 2012, we have not been allowed to impose indeterminate sentences. So now what you've got to do is, if it's a life sentence, you stipulate the minimum time before they can be released, before they're eligible for parole. So an indeterminate sentence is no longer allowed. In 2012, that was got rid of. So, as well as a custodial sentence, a court can impose a community sentence. And that's when the perpetrator serves their sentence in the community rather than in prison or jail. So that's something like, that could be probation orders, taggings, restrictions, curfews, attendance at anger management courses, mandatory drug testing, drug treatment orders, community payback. All those things are served in the community. The person doesn't go to prison. So you've got a custodial sentence, then you've got a community sentence. That's 2 of the 4. The third one you've got is a fine, financial penalties, and usually the size of the fine will depend on the seriousness of the offence or whether it's a repeat offence, and also the offender's ability to pay. So if someone is on benefits, they're not going to get a huge fine because they can't afford to pay it. And there's also the possibility of offenders being able to pay in instalments. So that's 3 of the 4, and your final one is a discharge, and people often forget this. So there are 4 sanctions that can be imposed by a court: custodial, community, fines, discharges. You have to know those 4. Learn them, guys. It comes up every year. So there are different types of discharge. You can have a conditional discharge, which involves the offender committing no further offence for a given period. So basically, it's almost like a parole. If they commit an offence during the time, the court can impose a sentence for the original offence as well as the new one. So you're living on borrowed time, basically. Or the court could grant an unconditional or absolute discharge. And that is where the defendant's technically guilty or where punishment would be inappropriate. And that's not classed as a conviction. That tends to be where they think the trauma of going to court, etc., is punishment enough. So that's an unconditional absolute discharge, and that's not a conviction. Okay, so remember those 4 different types of sanctions that can be imposed by a court. And that leads us then on to what the police can do. So in the case of some minor offences, the police can impose sanctions as well without making someone go to court. So they can issue cautions or penalty notices. So for instance, if you're pulled over for speeding by a police car on the motorway, you can actually pay the fine there and then, have the points in your licence if you've got your insurance documents and your driving licence, and go on your way. So cautions are warnings that are given by the police to anyone aged 10 or over for minor crimes such as graffiti, whatever. Or conditional cautions mean you have to stick to certain rules and restrictions, such as going for drug treatment. If you break the conditions, you get charged with a crime. And of course, as I said, motoring fines, that sort of stuff. Penalty notices. So these can be issued for minor crimes such as shoplifting, possession of cannabis, and you don't get a penalty if you pay you don't get a conviction if you pay the penalty. However, if you disagree, you have the right to go to court instead and let a magistrate or a jury decide. That's your decision. And of course, there are other implications to committing a criminal act, not just the sentence that you served or the fine you've paid or the community service you've done, but you can be excluded as a result of a crime from certain occupations, such as working with young people. Anyone that applies to be a teacher has to have an enhanced DBS, a check done, their criminal past. If you commit a crime against a sex crime, you can be placed on the Violent and Sex Offenders Register, VISA. You can face travel ban to certain countries, or you will be required to have a special visa if you have a criminal record to enter other countries. And you can also have restrictions on things like being able to adopt, jury service, standing for elected office as an MP. And you often have to declare unspent convictions when obtaining insurance. So there's an example of an enhanced certificate for the DBS, Disclosure and Barring Service, and you have to apply for that. Every teacher, anyone working with children, has to have one of those. And I've put there, this is for VISA, the Sex Offenders Register. This is for how long you would be on the Sex Offenders Register, depending on your age and what your sentence was. So you can see if you are in prison for 30 years or more, whether you are under 18 or over 18, indefinitely on that register. If you're more than 6 months but less than 30 months, it's 10 years if you're over 18, 5 years if you're under 18. So you can have a think about that. So we've already touched on this idea of whether something can be criminal but not deviant. And let's think about this in a little more detail. So not all acts that are classified as crime are particularly serious, and some may be widely regarded as not even particularly deviant. For example, and this is the example I would use, while possession of cannabis is a crime, some don't regard it as bad behaviour. So to complicate matters further, society is often divided on whether a particular crime is actually deviant. For example, many other people do see possession of cannabis as morally wrong and hence deviant. And then deviant but not criminal? Well, some acts that people see as deviant are not always crimes. For example, and we're going to do this in much more detail in AC1.2, although homosexual acts between consenting adults are no longer illegal in the UK, some people regard it as morally wrong and therefore deviant. So this kind of issue often arises when social attitudes are changing. So that's crime and deviance, an introduction, a basic idea of what the two are. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, my final slide, which is this one, looks at some of the questions that you can be asked in the exam. So I've got some selections here. So have a look at these questions. Describe formal sanctions against criminals, compare criminality and deviance with reference to relevant examples, explain why it's difficult to define the word crime, and explain the term deviance and use examples to support your comments. So hopefully you'll be able to answer those questions now, and you found this informative. That ends my presentation. I look forward to seeing you when I do AC 1.2.